welcome to a tutorial on managing patient finances in the Bridget program. Now, the software is very flexible when it comes to invoicing patients and taking payments, and of course it needs to be. In many practices it's not necessarily the case that a treatment is done, an invoice is raised and a payment is immediately made in order to settle the account. Of course there may be various scenarios, such as creating an invoice with multiple providers performing treatments across a number of appointments, or a payment may be made that's only meant for specific items on an invoice, or that maybe is only meant to be applied to one provider on an invoice and not to others. Or of course a single payment can be made that's either a part payment or is meant to apply to multiple invoices. So there needs to be quite a lot of flexibility in the way that Bridget handles patient finances. So when it comes to handling these things, the first thing we need to do as a practice is to decide what our practice-wide credit handling policy will be. Now, in order to do this, we're going to look at each feature of the credit handling policy so that you can better decide which one would be best for your practice. So to get to that, we go to File in the top left-hand corner and we simply select Practice Settings. Then we select the Financial tab, and here we can see we have the credit handling policy. So there are three different ways of handling payments in Bridget by default. So we have allocate automatically based on the payment date. We have allocate automatically based on the provider, or manually allocate all credit to invoices. So let's go through each one of these. What does it mean to allocate automatically based on payment date? Well, this basically means that a payment will be allocated to all treatment items that are on an invoice, and payments are used against the oldest outstanding invoices first. Now, this is the default policy for the program and is generally the most common way practices work, especially smaller practices. What about the second one? Allocate automatically based on provider. Well, this means that when you take a payment, you select the provider whom the payment is meant to be for, and that payment will then only apply to invoice treatments by that provider. In fact, if a payment is taken that is in excess of the treatment that the provider has performed, the additional credit will actually sit in the patient's account and it will not be allocated to other providers unless specifically told to do so by the user. So this kind of policy is therefore useful for practices that might regularly take a payment up front for upcoming treatment with one provider, say a hygiene visit for the future, but in the meantime the patient comes and visits the dentist. In that situation, you don't want the payment that you've taken in advance for the hygienist to be applied to the dental appointment. So you'd want to take a separate payment for that. So if you'd like payments to mainly apply to specific providers, then select this policy as the default for your practice. And then finally, we have the manually allocate all credit to invoices. And this is just as it says on the tin. It means that rather than relying on the program to auto-allocate payments to invoices itself, you rely solely on the discretion of the reception staff to make the right decision as to how and when to apply a payment to an invoice. So if you want maximum flexibility, select this option. So we're going to go through each one step by step and we'll see in practice how each one of them works. So let's start with the default, which is allocate automatically based on payment date. So let's open up our first patient record, who is Ben Gardner here. If I go to his charting, we can see that an examination has been done, and that's by MS, who is Dr. Michael Smith, but he's also had a hygiene visit by Gemma Greaves. So if I charge for these treatments, we'll see our invoice appear with each of the line items. It's got our provider, it's got our value, our total value of each of those fees that have been charged for those treatments. Notice we also have this allocated column. The allocated column indicates how many funds have currently been allocated to each of these lines. Now at the moment there are no payments in the patient's account, so we don't see them down here at the bottom of the screen, and of course nothing is allocated therefore. So we're raising an invoice for £155 and the amount outstanding is still £155. So at this point we're going to save and close. Patient has now been charged. If I go to my accounts, I can see this outstanding invoice which appears in bold, and I can see that it's still in debit by £155. So let's make a payment, and we're going to say the payment method is by credit debit card, and I'm going to choose let's say the main dentist, Michael Smith, as being the provider reference. So this is the person that the payment that I'm taking is essentially going to be for. So at this point we can either tick the boxes that we want to pay, and notice we see not only the overall invoice but we can see each line item. So if you want to pay for a specific line item, we don't need to type a value in, we can actually just, for example, tick that we want to just pay for the examination, and that will bring up our total there. Or we can do all of them and come to our £155. But just to show you how the auto allocation works, if I type in £100 and I auto allocate, it will basically, starting from the top, it will just simply allocate our funds according to date. It's not interested in the provider, it's just saying £100 has been taken, I'm going to assign that £100 to this invoice. So that's how allocating by date actually works. And if we had older invoices in here, it would allocate this amount to those older ones first before it started allocating payments to our latest invoice. At the bottom here you can see we also have an unallocated field. So if I were to type in more than the value of the current invoices and then press allocate this payment, it assigns the £300 to our invoice, but there is some left over, and so it's just showing us that £144.50 is currently unallocated in the patient's account. So if I save and close that, I can see that my invoice is now paid in full. I can see the allocated amounts now against my individual line items, £50.50 and £105, and down the bottom I can see any payments that have been allocated against my current invoice. If I go into the payment, again I can see all of the invoices that this payment has been allocated to, as well as the current unallocated value. The payment is actually appearing in bold here because it's showing you that there is unallocated funds against it. So that's allocating by default by date. Let's go on to our second option. So back to the financial tab. This time we're going to select allocate automatically based on provider. Okay, that. And we're going to open up Lucas Canada's patient record. Now here, if I go to the charting, we can see that this patient has had 3 different treatments by 3 different providers. Michael Smith, Gemma Greaves, and this one here is Jim Carter. If I go to the accounts, rather than putting them all on one invoice, which we could have done of course, what we've done is we've raised 3 separate invoices for each provider. So what we're going to do is now make a payment. And now notice if I choose my payment method, and I'm going to say this provider reference, I want this to be allocated only to Jim Carter. So this payment is going to be for Jim Carter. And now if I type in a value and auto allocate the payment, notice it's no longer allocating by date, it's allocating by provider. So in this instance the £100 has been completely ignored by these other line items for Gemma Greaves and for Michael Smith, and it's only allocated itself to Jim Carter. So £100 has been taken off his invoice. In fact, because it only allocates to that one provider, if I type in more than the value of the overall invoice for Jim Carter and allocate this payment, it's actually not allocating the additional funds to these other invoices because it knows those are by different providers. So it's carrying forward the excess unallocated £98.50 and only allocating £201.50 of the £300 to Jim Carter. Again, if I save and close that now, I can see that that invoice has been paid and these two invoices are still outstanding. And if I double click on here again, it's in bold because it's showing us it has unallocated funds. Now what happens if we realise, well, hold on a moment, I actually should have allocated some of that payment to one of these other invoices by a different provider. In fact, I want to. We've changed our minds and we want to allocate it. In that case, we can simply double click on the invoice that we do want to pay with those funds. And there's a button here that says reallocate funds. Now this button will only appear on an invoice when it knows there are outstanding funds within the patient record ready to be reallocated. So at the moment we see there is no allocation against this hygiene session, but if I reallocate funds, it will now show me the payment, the unallocated funds that are still from the payment for Dr. Jim Carter, and I can now automatically allocate this payment to this invoice. So if I save and close that, all of the unallocated funds of this payment have now been used, and it's showing me it's being allocated to Gemma Greaves and to Jim Carter. So you can see how allocation by provider works. In order for a payment to actually be assigned to a different provider, we have to take steps in order to override the natural function or the default function of the program. So finally, let's look at manual allocation. So manually allocate all credit to invoices. As I say, this is the simplest way or the most flexible way of being able to charge and allocate funds towards invoices. So in this instance we see that two treatments have been done, an examination and a hygiene session by two different providers, but we've actually got a payment in the account already that has been taken in advance, and that payment has been allocated to Michael Smith. In fact, there's £200 sitting in the patient's account waiting to be allocated. So I can charge for those outstanding treatments, and here I can simply select pay, which will pay the full value. Notice my £200 has gone towards the examination and the hygiene session, which is the same really as doing allocate by date in this instance. But notice if I were to say, press this button here, allocate by provider, because it knows that payment was taken for Michael Smith, it's only assigned a part of my payment only to Michael Smith, not to Gemma Greaves. So we can very flexibly choose how we want to pay things by using this method. So in this instance, let's apply the whole payment to that whole invoice, which has now paid off that invoice, and the patient still has £44.50 in credit. So what do we do if a patient is not happy with a treatment and they want a partial or a full refund of a payment that they've made? So again, let's just demonstrate that. If we open up Lucas Canada's record, for example, if I go to the Accounts tab, if I want to refund any of this payment that has been made, I just double click on the payment, and there will be this refund button at the top of the screen. So anytime you want to refund a payment, simply press on the refund button. That will allow us to put in our refund method and the amount that we want to refund. Again, we can choose exactly the provider who we're going to be refunding. In this instance, let's say Jim Carter, and let's say the patient wants £50 back. So we simply save and close that. That has now refunded part of that payment, it's done it in such a way that it hasn't affected the account balance. If I go back into the payment now, I can see that £50 of this overall 300 was refunded, and that will appear on our various reports at the end of the day when we do them. So that covers the 3 credit handling policies, and you can decide how your own practice wants best to work. But as mentioned, if we go back into our file and practice settings and click on financial, these are simply the default way that the program will automatically assign payments to invoices, but they can be overridden, but only where the practice owner or the practice manager decides that a person has the right to override that default decision. So in the instance where we have our credit handling policy as allocating payments based on provider, the only way that a member of the reception staff will be able to override that is if they're given permission to do so in the security settings. So if you want to allow, generally you want payments to be based on provider, for example, but you want to allow flexibility to allow that to be overridden by your reception staff where necessary, then we need to add that as a security task to their security group. And the way we do that is we go to security on the left hand side, which you'll only have access to if you're one of the practice managers, and on the right hand side here, if I just only show financial related security tasks, notice there is this security task, allow payment allocation override. So unless this is added to the patient's security group, or rather the provider's security group, then the person will not be able to override the way that payments are allocated to invoices. So if you want that flexibility, simply drag the allow patient allocation override over the security group that you want to permit access, and then those people in that security group will be able to override any payments that are made to invoices where it's necessary. Now, because payments can be made which are not allocated to invoices in the patient record, it will of course be necessary now and again to check that the patient's accounts are correct. For example, let's go into the Bruno Ashby patient record here. We can see that this person has 2 payments on account, one for Michael Smith and one for Gemma Greaves. So let's charge the patient for the treatments that have been done. Down the bottom, it's automatically allocating at the moment by provider, so it's taking our payments and it's allocating them across our invoice and paying it off, which is fine. But let's say we manually override these payments and we say, actually, I'm not going to pay any of this off. I want this invoice to be outstanding by £140, and I'm not going to use any of the funds which are in the patient's account. It's warning us, of course, that this is the case. So there will always be warnings where we try to do these things. It will tell us, hold on, you've got allocate by provider as your default setting, but £140 is outstanding and £140 remains unallocated. Press yes if this is correct. Well, in this instance, we're going to say it is correct. So now we have an unusual situation where we've got payments in the patient's account which should actually be allocated to this invoice, but they haven't been. So we want to be notified of that somehow and check that these things are not being missed. Now that will be in 2 places. Firstly, when we produce our end of day report, which is on the home screen. If I just click on create end of day report, I will see on here, as well as all of my other accounts, payments received, refunds that have been made, all of those appear on our end of day report. It's also got an outstanding invoices with unallocated payments. So it is showing us each one of these. We can see there is £140 outstanding on each of these invoices, and there is unallocated payments within that patient record. So that's one place we can see it at the end of each day, or we can go to reports and then select financial, and here we have a whole outstanding invoices with unallocated payments report. So anytime we want to, we can just say, well, I want to check all patient records and just find any which might be incorrectly allocated. And what we have here are showing us a report of outstanding invoices with unallocated payments. The black ones are for different providers, so that might be normal. It may be that we want invoices to be outstanding because no payment has been taken for that specific provider. So we've got payments sitting in account which are not taken against that particular provider on the invoice. But in this instance, in blue, we've got a provider match, which means that Lucy Williams, the invoicing provider, or the invoice treatment item, is by Michael Smith for £201.50. And notice that there's a payment also for Michael Smith, which has not been allocated. So we'd want to pay particular attention to these bold blue accounts and probably go back into Lucy Williams' record and allocate that payment to that invoice. In fact, we can do that now. If we go to Lucy Williams, visit the accounts, there's the outstanding payment, there's the outstanding invoice, and I simply double click the invoice, select reallocate funds, and now I can allocate the amount that's sitting in the account to that particular invoice. That's now paid those off, and that's account balance is now correct. So that's a useful report to keep in mind when we want to keep on top of any unallocated funds that are within the patient record. So that covers the charging of treatments within the patient record and also taking payments, and covers the different credit handling policies we may have and want to choose from. So we hope you found this tutorial helpful, and thanks for watching.